The stars had always called to Jake Harris, even as a boy growing up on his family's small farm in Nebraska. He would spend his nights staring at the sky, dreaming of the worlds that existed beyond the blue atmosphere of Earth. Now, at 32 years old, he was living that dream as a lieutenant in the United Earth Space Corps, piloting scout vessels through the outer reaches of explored space. His current mission was simple: patrol the border regions near the Kepler system, document any unusual activity, and report back to command. It was the kind of assignment they gave to experienced pilots who needed a break from the more dangerous work. Jake had spent the last 3 years running rescue operations in hostile territory, and his commanders had decided he deserved something quieter. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. Jake was running a routine scan of an asteroid field when his instruments began to malfunction. The readings made no sense. His navigation computer showed him in 3 different locations at once. His communication array filled with static. And then, without any warning, his ship lurched violently to the side. He grabbed the controls and tried to stabilize, but it was like fighting against an invisible giant. Something had taken hold of his vessel, some kind of gravitational field that his sensors could not identify. Through the cockpit window, Jake watched in horror as a massive shape emerged from the darkness between the asteroids. It was a ship, but unlike anything he had ever seen. The vessel was at least 5 miles long, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow with their own light. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like a predator made of metal and starlight. Jake's fingers flew across his console as he tried to send a distress signal. He managed to transmit his coordinates and a brief message before the alien ship pulled him inside through an opening that appeared in its hull. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was a hangar filled with other captured vessels, dozens of them, from species he did not recognize. When Jake opened his eyes again, he was no longer in his ship. He lay on a cold floor in a chamber made of white material that seemed to produce its own soft glow. His wrists were bound by rings of blue light that held him firmly but did not hurt. He tested them carefully and found that he could not break free. The sound of footsteps made him look up. She was tall. That was the first thing Jake noticed. Nearly 7 feet in height, with a powerful build that suggested she could break him in half without much effort. Her skin was a deep violet color, smooth and flawless. Her eyes were silver, like polished mirrors, and they studied him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. Her hair was pure white flowing down her back, and woven into it was an intricate crown made of some dark metal. She wore armor that looked both ceremonial and functional, decorated with the same strange symbols he had seen on the ship. Everything about her radiated power and authority. She spoke, and to his surprise, he understood her. The words seemed to translate themselves in his mind, though he did not know how. She told him that she was High Empress Viral of the Jithran Dominion. She ruled 12 star systems and commanded the greatest fleet in the known galaxy. She welcomed him to her vessel. Jake pushed himself up to a sitting position, refusing to show fear even though his heart was pounding. He told her his name and rank and demanded to know why he had been captured. Viral smiled at that, a cold expression that did not reach her silver eyes. She explained that her people had been watching humanity for many years. They found his species fascinating. Humans were weak compared to most spacefaring races, short-lived and fragile. Yet they had spread across the stars with remarkable speed. They adapted to environments that should have killed them. They refused to accept defeat, even when victory was impossible. She had seen the recordings of his capture, she continued. She had watched him fight against a tractor beam until the last moment, refusing to surrender even when his ship was falling apart around him. She found his courage impressive. Jake asked what she wanted from him. Viral began to circle him slowly, like a predator examining its prey. She explained that her people had a tradition. When a warrior empress captured an enemy who showed exceptional bravery, she had the right to claim him. She could take him as her consort, elevating him to a position of honor within the Dominion. Or she could condemn him to serve as her prisoner, laboring in the mineral mines beneath her homeworld, until his body failed. She stopped in front of him and looked down with those silver eyes. She was offering him a choice. He could become her husband, share her throne, and live a life of privilege. Or he could spend his remaining years in chains, digging ore from the depths of a world that had never seen sunlight. Jake's mind raced. He knew he was in an impossible situation. He had no weapon, no allies, and no way to escape. The logical thing to do was to accept her offer and become her consort. At least then he would survive. But something in him refused to simply give in. He was a human being, not a trophy to be collected. He would not sell himself so easily. He met her gaze without looking away. He asked how long he had to decide. For a moment, surprise flickered across Viral's face. She had expected immediate surrender, or perhaps desperate resistance. She had not expected calm negotiation. She told him he had until the next lunar cycle of her homeworld. In human time, that was 3 days. Jake nodded slowly. He told her he would give her his answer then. Viral studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. It was not warmth exactly, but perhaps a hint of respect. She told her guards to take him to the consort quarters. He would have freedom to move within those rooms, but any attempt to escape would be punished severely. As the guards led him away, Jake allowed himself one glance back at the Empress. She was still watching him, her silver eyes thoughtful. He had 3 days. 3 days to find a way out of this situation, or at least to find a way to turn it to his advantage. He did not know how he would do it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to be anyone's prisoner. And he was not going to be anyone's trophy husband either. Whatever happened next, it would be on his terms. The game had just begun. The consort quarters were more luxurious than any place Jake had ever lived. The rooms were large and filled with soft furniture, strange alien art, and windows that looked out into the endless black of space. There was food that appeared on a table 3 times a day. Exotic dishes that tasted better than anything on Earth. There were clothes made of fabric so soft it felt like wearing clouds. It was a beautiful prison. Jake ignored the luxury. He had work to do. The Zitherans clearly believed that a single human male posed no threat. They had removed his restraints and left him largely unsupervised. Guards stood outside his door, but inside the quarters, he was alone. This was their first mistake. Jake spent his first day listening. Servants came and went, speaking to each other in their language. Thanks to whatever technology had translated the Empress's words, he could understand them as well. He pretended to be confused and defeated, sitting quietly while they cleaned and brought food. But his ears caught every word. He learned that the Empress was not as secure in her power as she appeared. There was a faction within the Dominion that opposed her, led by her own younger sister, a woman named Counselor Thyra. This faction believed that Viral was too soft, too interested in studying other species rather than conquering them. They wanted to return to the old ways. When the Zitherans crushed all who stood in their path, he learned that the Dominion was facing problems. The outer colonies were struggling with crop failures. The lower classes were growing restless. The military was stretched thin across 12 star systems. Viral's position was more fragile than her confident manner suggested. On his second day, Jake began to explore. The quarters had several rooms, and he examined each one carefully. He found a small device that seemed to be a data tablet, similar to the ones used on Earth, but with alien symbols on its surface. It took him hours of careful experimentation, but eventually he figured out how to access its basic functions. The information he found confirmed what he had heard from the servants. The Dominion was an empire in trouble. Reports showed declining production, increasing pirate activity in the outer systems, and growing tension between the different castes. Viral was trying to modernize her society, but she faced resistance at every turn. Jake also found information about himself. The Zitherans had been watching Earth for decades, collecting data on human culture, technology, and biology. They were particularly interested in human adaptability, the way his species could survive in almost any environment and bounce back from almost any disaster. To them, humans were a curiosity, a young species with potential that far exceeded their current power. He understood now why Viral wanted him as a consort. It was not just about having a trophy. It was about sending a message. By taking a human husband, she would be showing the galaxy that she was willing to work with other species, that the Dominion under her rule would be different from the Dominion of the past. But to her opponents, that same marriage would be proof of her weakness. A Zitharan empress with an alien consort? It was exactly the kind of thing that Thyra could use against her. On his third day, Jake made his decision. He could not escape. The ship was too large, and he had no way to reach his own vessel. Fighting was impossible, as he was one man against an empire. But there was another option, one that the Zitherans had not considered. He could become valuable, not as a trophy or a symbol, but as a true ally. When the guards came to bring him before the Empress that evening, Jake was ready. He walked with his head high, the stolen data tablet hidden beneath his clothing. He had disabled his restraints using techniques he had learned during his survival training, but he had not tried to escape. He wanted to make a point. The throne room was vast, filled with Zitharan nobles who had come to witness the human surrender. They looked at him with curiosity and contempt. This small creature, who had been given the honor of the Empress's attention, Viral sat on her throne, magnificent in ceremonial armor that made her look like a goddess of war. Her silver eyes found Jake as he approached, and he saw expectation in them. She believed he had come to accept her offer. Jake stopped at the proper distance and bowed his head briefly in respect. Then he looked up and spoke clearly so everyone could hear. He told her that he had a different proposal. Whispers erupted among the nobles. The guards moved forward, but Viral raised her hand to stop them. Her expression was unreadable, but Jake could see curiosity in the tilt of her head. He continued. He told her that he had spent 3 days learning about her situation. He knew about Counselor Thera and the coalition forming against her. He knew about the failing colonies and the unrest among her people. He knew that she did not just want a husband. She needed one who could help her hold her empire together. Jake pulled out the data tablet and held it up. He explained that he had accessed her ship's information network. He had read her reports, studied her problems, and analyzed her enemies. And he had ideas. The nobles erupted in outrage. A human reading classified Dominion information? It was an insult beyond measure. Several called for his immediate execution. But Viral remained silent, her silver eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made the room feel very small. Jake pressed on. He told her that he would agree to the marriage, but not as her property. He would stand beside her as an equal partner, a true consort with real authority. In exchange, he would help her defeat Thyra, stabilize her colonies, and open diplomatic channels with Earth. Humanity might be young, but his people had much to offer: technology, ideas, and a perspective that the Dominion desperately needed. He lowered the tablet and met her gaze directly. He told her that she could find 1,000 trophy husbands if that was what she wanted. But she would only find one who could help her save her empire. For a long moment, silence filled the throne room. The nobles waited for their empress to order the human's death. The guards stood ready to carry out her command. Instead, Viral smiled. It was a different smile than before. Less cold, almost genuine. She stood from her throne and walked down to where Jake stood. Up close, she was even more imposing, towering over him by more than a foot. But Jake did not back away. She told him that humans were far more interesting than her. Scouts had reported. She extended her hand. The traditional Zithran gesture of agreement. Jake took it without hesitation. The deal was made. The marriage ceremony of a Zithran empress was a spectacle unlike anything in human experience. It was broadcast across all 12 star systems, watched by billions of citizens who had never seen anything like it. When Jake Harris walked down the central aisle of the great temple, dressed in the ceremonial armor of a royal consort, gasps and whispers followed every step he took. The armor was beautiful, crafted from the same dark metal as Viral's crown, decorated with symbols that marked him as her chosen. It had been fitted to his human body with surprising precision, and despite its heavy appearance, it moved with him like a second skin. He walked with his head high, showing no fear, meeting the eyes of every noble who stared at him with contempt. At the end of the aisle, Viral waited for him. She was dressed in pure white, the traditional color of Zithran brides, and for the first time, Jake saw her without armor. She looked almost soft, though he knew better than to mistake appearance for weakness. Her silver eyes tracked him as he approached, and something in them had changed since their first meeting. There was curiosity there, and perhaps the beginning of respect. The ceremony itself was long and filled with rituals that Jake did not fully understand. There were chants and offerings, exchanges of symbolic gifts, and finally a moment where their hands were bound together with bands of light while an ancient priestess spoke words of union. Throughout it all, Jake remained calm and dignified, playing his role perfectly. When it was over, he was no longer a prisoner. He was the consort of the High Empress, second only to Viral, herself in the hierarchy of the Dominion. The work began immediately. Jake had promised to help stabilize the Empire, and he took that promise seriously. The first challenge was the failing colonies in the outer systems. The Zithran approach to agriculture was based on massive industrial operations that stripped the soil of nutrients within a few generations. They would simply move on to new worlds when the old ones failed. But they were running out of new worlds to exploit. Jake remembered his childhood on the farm. The lessons his grandfather had taught him about crop rotation and sustainable farming. It seemed so simple compared to the vast complexity of interstellar agriculture, but the core principles were the same. He worked with Zithran scientists to develop new techniques based on human methods, ways to restore the soil rather than destroy it. The results were not immediate, but within a few months, the struggling colonies began to show improvement. Production increased. The unrest among the workers began to fade, and Jake's reputation among the common people of the Dominion began to grow. His second challenge was more dangerous. Counselor Thyra had not given up her ambitions. She continued to gather supporters among the nobles, spreading whispers that the Empress had been corrupted by alien influence. She called Jake a parasite, a creature who had seduced his way into power. Her words found fertile ground among those who resented any change to the traditional Zithran way of life. Jake knew that Thyra would eventually move against them. The question was when and how. He began training Zithran military officers in unconventional tactics. Human warfare was different from Zithran warfare. The Zithrans believed in overwhelming force, in crushing enemies through superior numbers and firepower. Humans, smaller and weaker than most species, had learned to fight differently. They used deception and surprise. They struck where the enemy was weak and faded away before retaliation could come. They turned their weaknesses into advantages. Many of the officers resisted at first. They saw human tactics as cowardly, unworthy of true warriors. But some began to understand. In a universe where the Dominion faced enemies on multiple fronts, adaptability was more valuable than pride. The confrontation with Thyra came sooner than expected. It happened at a diplomatic banquet, a grand event meant to celebrate a new trade agreement with a neighboring species. The hall was filled with nobles from across the Dominion, along with ambassadors from a dozen different worlds. Jake stood beside Viral as she greeted guests and accepted congratulations on the success of her economic reforms. He noticed the servant almost by accident. The young Zitharan female was carrying a tray of wine glasses, moving through the crowd toward the Empress. There was nothing unusual about that, but something in her manner caught Jake's attention. Her movements were too stiff. Her eyes kept darting toward a figure in the corner of the room. Jake followed her gaze and saw Counselor Thera watching the servant with barely concealed anticipation. His instincts screamed a warning dot as the servant approached. Jake moved casually to intercept. He took 2 glasses from her tray with a smile, as if simply selecting refreshments for himself and the Empress. The servant hesitated, confusion flickering across her face, but she could not refuse without drawing attention. Jake carried the glasses to a quiet corner and examined them closely. The wine in both glasses looked identical, but when he held them to the light at a certain angle, he noticed a slight difference in color. One glass had something added to it. He did not drink from either glass. Instead, he quietly summoned a guard and ordered the wine to be tested. Within an hour, the results were clear. One glass contained a slow-acting poison, undetectable by normal means. That would have killed Viral within a week. The servant broke under questioning and revealed that Thera had paid her to deliver the poisoned wine to the Empress. By morning, Thera was under arrest. Her supporters scattered and exposed. Jake stood beside Viral as the guards led her sister away in chains. Thyra screamed insults and threats, promising that this was not over, that the human would pay for his interference. Jake watched her go without expression. When they were alone, Viral turned to look at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly. She told him that she had expected many things when she took him as consort. She had expected a trophy, a curiosity, perhaps a useful symbol. She had not expected someone who would save her life. Jake shrugged slightly. He told her that he had made a deal. He kept his promises. Viral studied him with those silver eyes, and for the first time, Jake saw genuine warmth in them. She told him that he was a strange creature. He smiled. He told her that was the nicest thing she had ever said to him. Something shifted between them in that moment. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something more than politics, more than alliance. It was the beginning of trust. And in the games of empires, trust was the most valuable currency of all. News traveled fast across the galaxy. Within weeks of Thera's arrest, every major power knew about the human consort who had saved the Zitharan Empress from assassination. Some species watched with curiosity. Others watched with concern. And one species watched with cold calculation. The Krell Collective had been enemies of the Zitharan Dominion for over 1,000 years. They were an insectoid race, billions of individuals connected through a shared hive mind that allowed them to act with perfect coordination. What one Krell knew, all Krell knew. What one Krell decided, all Krell obeyed. They had no concept of individuality, no understanding of personal ambition or love. They saw other species as resources to be consumed or obstacles to be eliminated. The collective had been content to maintain a cold peace with the Dominion in recent years. Neither side could gain decisive advantage over the other, so both had focused on other goals. But the alliance forming between the Zitharans and humanity changed everything. Humans were dangerous. Not because of their strength, for they were weak. Not because of their technology, for it was primitive compared to both the Krell and the Zitharans. Humans were dangerous because of their ideas. They spread through the galaxy like a virus, infecting other species with concepts like individual freedom and cooperative partnership. If humanity fully allied with the Dominion, they would bring those ideas with them. The rigid order of Zithran society would begin to change. And change was unpredictable. The collective could not allow such unpredictability to grow. They chose their moment carefully. The Festival of Stars was the most important celebration in the Zithran calendar, a time when the entire Dominion gathered to honor their ancestors and pray for prosperity. During the festival, military patrols were reduced. Defense stations operated with skeleton crews. The entire empire let down its guard to focus on celebration. Jake was standing beside Viral on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace when the attack began. They were watching the display of lights in the sky, thousands of small ships creating patterns that told the stories of Zithran history. It was beautiful, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to relax. Then the sky filled with fire. The Krell fleet emerged from hyperspace without warning. Hundreds of warships appearing all at once in the space above the capital world. They began firing immediately, their weapons tearing through the ceremonial display ships like paper. Within seconds, the celebration became a massacre. Alarms screamed throughout the palace. Servants and nobles ran in panic while guards tried to maintain order. Jake grabbed Viral's arm and pulled her toward the command center, where they could coordinate the defense. The situation was desperate. The Zithran fleet was scattered across the Dominion, and only a fraction of their ships were near the capital. The forces they could muster were outnumbered at least 5-1. Viral took command with the cold efficiency that made her a great leader, ordering formations and deployments with rapid precision. But even her tactical brilliance could not overcome such impossible odds. Jake watched the battle unfold on the holographic display, seeing Zithran ships destroyed one after another. The Krell advanced with mechanical precision, exploiting every weakness, crushing every attempt at resistance. For the first time since he had known her, Jake saw fear in Viral's silver eyes. She turned to him and spoke quietly, so the officers around them could not hear. She told him that she was sorry. She had hoped that their alliance would protect his people. Instead, she had brought them into a war they could not win. Jake took her hands in his. He told her to trust him. Then he smiled and added that he had been busy these past few months. Viral looked at him in confusion. Jake turned to the communication officer and gave him a specific frequency to broadcast on. The officer hesitated, looking to the Empress for confirmation. She nodded, and the transmission went out. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Krell continued their advance. Zithran ships continued to fall. And then, at the edge of the system, new contacts appeared on the sensors. Human ships. They emerged from hyperspace in tight formation. Dozens of vessels, led by a massive carrier that dwarfed everything else in the human fleet. Jake felt his heart swell with pride as he saw them. The resolute flagship of the United Earth Space Corps, commanded by his old friend Captain Danny Cole. Jake had been sending coded messages to Earth since shortly after his marriage. He had explained the situation, the alliance, the threats facing the Dominion. He had asked for help, not as a prisoner begging for rescue, but as an ambassador requesting military support. And Earth had answered. The human fleet was smaller than either the Krell or Zithran forces. By any logical calculation, they should have made no difference. But humans did not fight by logical calculations. The Resolute broadcast a message on all frequencies. Captain Cole's voice was calm and professional as he announced that the United Earth Space Corps stood with their allies against unprovoked aggression. All Krell forces were ordered to withdraw immediately or face the consequences. The Krell responded with contempt. They knew the numbers. They knew humans were weak. They continued their attack. What followed next became legendary. Human pilots flew with a recklessness that seemed suicidal. They dove straight toward Krell formations, releasing their weapons at the last possible moment before breaking away in maneuvers that should have torn their ships apart. When they did crash, they ejected at the last second. Their survival pods retrieved by support craft that darted through the battlefield like insects. Human Marines boarded Krell command ships using breaching pods that punched through enemy hulls. They fought through corridors designed for insectoid bodies, adapting on the fly to the strange architecture. Within hours, 3 Krell command vessels had been captured intact. Their connection to the hive mind severed. Human electronic warfare specialists attacked the Krell communication network directly. The hive mind depended on constant connection between all members. When those connections were disrupted, entire Krell squadrons became confused, unable to coordinate with the rest of their forces. By dawn, the Krell were in full retreat. Their invasion had failed. Their losses were enormous. And across the Dominion, Zitherans watched in stunned amazement as the small human fleet pursued their ancient enemies back into the darkness of space. Viral stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the human ships form up alongside her own. The battle was over. Her empire was saved. She turned to Jake, who had remained by her side throughout the entire fight. She asked him what his people wanted in return for their help. Jake smiled, exhaustion and relief showing on his face. He told her that they wanted friendship, maybe some trade agreements, and definitely the recipe for that purple wine she kept in her private quarters. Viral stared at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since Jake had known her, she laughed. It was a genuine sound, full of surprise and warmth. She told him that he was absolutely ridiculous. Jake agreed, cheerfully. They stood together as the stars returned to their peaceful patterns, the fires of battle fading into memory. A new chapter in galactic history had begun, and humanity had written itself into the story in a way no one could ever ignore. 5 years had passed since the Battle of the Festival, and the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The alliance between humanity and the Zithran Dominion had grown from a military partnership into something much deeper. Trade ships traveled between Earth and the Dominion's 12 star systems, carrying goods, ideas, and people in both directions. Human engineers worked alongside Zithran scientists to develop new technologies. Zithran warriors trained with human special forces, learning the unconventional tactics that had helped defeat the Krell. And everywhere, the two species discovered that they had more in common than anyone had expected. Other species watched this partnership with growing interest. The rigid hierarchies that had dominated galactic politics for millennia began to crack. If the mighty Zitherans could work alongside the young humans as equals, perhaps other alliances were possible. Perhaps the old ways of conquest and domination were not the only path forward. One by one, other species began reaching out. The Valori Merchants Guild, known for their isolation, requested trade negotiations. The Scythian Republic, once a vassal state of the Dominion, asked for a new treaty based on mutual respect rather than subjugation. Even the surviving Krell, shattered by their defeat and fragmented into independent clusters, sent cautious messages of non-aggression. Jake Harris stood at the center of this transformation. His official title was Imperial Consort, but everyone called him the Bridge Builder. He traveled constantly, meeting with alien leaders, negotiating agreements and solving problems that arose between different species. He had become the face of the new order, living proof that cooperation could replace conflict. It was exhausting work, but Jake would not have traded it for anything. Every treaty he signed, every conflict he helped resolve, every relationship he helped build, it all mattered. He was helping to create a future where his children, where all children, might grow up in a galaxy at peace. And speaking of children, that was another change that no one had expected. Zithran and human biology were vastly different. No one believed that a hybrid child was possible. But nature, it seemed, enjoyed surprises. After 3 years of marriage, Viral announced that she was pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl who carried genetics from both their parents. The news sent shockwaves through both species. For the Zitherans, it meant that their empress would have heirs who were partly alien. For humans, it meant that their species could create new life with beings from across the stars. The implications were staggering. Jake had been terrified at first. What kind of life would his children have? How would they be treated by a galaxy that still struggled with prejudice and fear? Would they be accepted anywhere, or would they be outcasts everywhere? Viral had seen his fear and, in her direct way, had dismissed it entirely. She told him that their children would be the heirs to the Zitharan dominion. Anyone who treated them with disrespect would answer to her personally. Besides, she added with a hint of a smile, they would have his stubbornness and her strength. The galaxy should be afraid of them. The twins were born on a clear night on the Zitharan homeworld. Jake held them in his arms and felt a love so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. They were small and strange and perfect, with violet skin like their mother and dark eyes like their father. They were something new in the universe, a bridge between species made flesh. Jake named the boy Sam after his grandfather back in Nebraska. Viral named the girl Kirill after a legendary Zitharan warrior queen. Together, they represented everything that their parents had fought to build. On the night of the twins' first birthday, Jake stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, looking out at the stars. It was late, and the celebration had finally ended. The guests had gone home. The servants had cleaned up. And for the first time in days, Jake had a moment to himself. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without looking that it was Viral. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. For a long moment, they simply looked at the stars together in comfortable silence. Finally, Viral spoke. She reminded him of when she first captured him and brought him aboard her ship. She told him that she had seen a specimen, a curiosity, something to be studied and perhaps used. She admitted that she had been arrogant. She had believed that she understood humans from the reports of her scouts. Jake smiled. He asked her what she understood now. Viral turned to look at him. Her silver eyes, which had once seemed so cold, were warm with emotions that had taken years to develop. She told him that she understood nothing. Every time she thought she had figured him out, he surprised her again. He was frustrating and confusing and absolutely impossible to predict. Jake laughed. He told her that he was human. They were all like that. Viral reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were longer than his, stronger, but her touch was gentle. She told him that she had something to confess. When she had offered him the choice between marriage and imprisonment, she had expected him to choose prison. Every other species she had encountered would have chosen death over becoming the consort of an alien empress. But he had chosen a third option, one she had not even considered. He had chosen to become her partner. Jake squeezed her hand. He told her that it was the best choice he had ever made. They stood together as the stars wheeled overhead. Behind them, somewhere in the palace, their children slept peacefully. Around them, a galaxy slowly learned to set aside ancient hatreds and build something new. And within them, two hearts that had started so far apart had somehow found their way to each other. It had not been an easy journey. There had been conflicts and misunderstandings, moments when both of them had wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But they had worked through each problem together, learning and growing and changing along the way. That was what love was, Jake had come to understand. Not a feeling that appeared fully formed, but a choice that was made again and again. Every single day, he had chosen Viral. She had chosen him. And together, they had chosen to build a future that neither of them could have imagined alone. Across the galaxy, Other species watched and wondered. If a human and a Zithran could create such a partnership, if they could build a family that bridged the gap between worlds, what else might be possible? The answer, Jake knew, was anything. Everything. The universe was vast and full of potential. And humanity was just getting started. He looked up at the stars. The same stars he had dreamed about as a boy on his family's farm. He was still dreaming. But now, the dreams were real, and the best part was that they were only beginning.